Hello and welcome to the Shakespeare Podcast. In this episode we'll take a look at Shakespeare's Othello and ask the question, how do you introduce a play like Othello? Othello remains one of Shakespeare's most controversial plays due to its themes of race, gender and power. It has remained a favourite with actors and audiences for over 420 years. However, its critical reception and appraisal has varied widely over the centuries. Accounting for Othello's popularity is difficult, but so is accounting for Shakespeare's genius. We could argue that Shakespeare examining the questions and anxieties around race and racism guarantees that any audience will understand what's at stake in the play. However, there are other plays that have dealt with race over the centuries. One such example would be Edward Young's The Revenge, which opened at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane in 1721 to great success. The play recounts the story of an African prince, Zanga, who is sold as a slave into captivity but gets his revenge on his European owners. The Revenge was revived in 1798 by Kemble, and again with great success in 1815 by Edward Kean. The African-American actor Ira Aldridge played both Zanga and Othello on the English stage in the 1840s. Alas, Edward Young's play is now largely forgotten, while Shakespeare's Othello is still an audience favourite. Othello was grouped with Hamlet, Macbeth and King Lear by the hugely influential Shakespearean scholar A.C. Bradley as part of Shakespeare's 4 great tragedies, that's capital G, capital T. Othello's critical appraisal has undergone an enormous change in the last 40 years, largely thanks to new critical approaches to black issues, feminist writings, gender roles and textual strategies. Perhaps the best approach to introducing Othello is to look at what we can say about the play factually, where its source material may have come from, and then give some indication of the wide array of interpretations that Othello has attracted over the centuries. First of all, Othello was written between 1604 and 1602. We know that it was performed at Whitehall Palace in November of 1604. We know this because it was recorded in the lists by the Master of the Revels, Sir Edmund Tilney. How long it had been around before that is open to some very complicated conjecture. But Shakespeare seems to be referencing Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia when describing Othello's military exploits, and Pliny's book wasn't available in English until after 1601. Othello wasn't published until well after Shakespeare's death in 1616, and there are 2 versions of the play, the quarto edition of 1622 and the first folio edition of 1623. Between these 2 versions there are thousands of differences. Between one Othello and the other there is 160 lines which exists in one edition but not in the other. So to recap, the play was written sometime between 1602 and 1604, and of the 2 published versions of the play there are wide and numerous discrepancies. So glad we sorted that out. As you know, Shakespeare rarely wrote his own plots, and Othello is no exception. The main source for the play is said to be an Italian story, published in 1565 by a writer called Cinthio. The story is a fable or a morality tale entitled A Moor Captain, and was part of a collection of stories, one section of which concerns tales of unfaithful lovers. In the story, in Cinthio's story, a black soldier marries a white woman called Desdemona, who he suspects of infidelity. He's spurred on by his jealous ensign, and she is suspected of an affair with a character referred to as a captain. None of the male characters have a name. The Moor and the ensign murder Desdemona. Between them, they cover up the murder and they get away with it, at least in the short term. Shakespeare radicalises the whole story by making the characters more detailed and more motivated. Brabantino, Desdemona's father, his objections to his daughter's marriage to Othello is absent from the source material, as is Roderigo and the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. Perhaps an important part of the source material that Shakespeare retains is that of the Mediterranean setting, which is multicultural in nature and provides the opportunity for allusions to Turks and Muslims and Egyptians. And of course, in the source material, there is the intersection of race and gender. We find it in Cinthio's story, as we do in Shakespeare's Othello. So, let's look at some of the themes in Othello that help shape the play. One of those themes is the question of race, and we need to ask the question, is Othello racist, or is it a play about racism? The Shakespeare scholar Virginia Vaughan wrote, quote, "I think this play is racist, and I think that it is not." Which is to say that the answer to this question may be both. Certainly, there are racist terms used in the play. They are used by Iago in Act 1 when referring to Othello as, quote, "an old black ram" and, quote, "a Barbary horse." However, Iago is portrayed throughout the play as being coarse and vulgar, and in the very next scene we'll see Iago telling Othello how he stands up for Othello's good name. Is Shakespeare merely reflecting the racism of his time, or is Iago's racism and evil being used as a mirror to society to expose the realities of racism? Is Iago's duplicity and spitefulness meant as a warning for the audience? The situation is made more complex when we consider that Roderigo and Brabantio, Desdemona's father, also use racist terms, and at the end of the play, even Othello refers to his Turkish enemy as, quote, "the circumcised dog." It's clear that in the earlier part of the play, Iago often refers to people as animals, and that this use of language is picked up by Othello in the later parts of the play, as if Iago succeeds in dragging Othello down to his level, coarse, vulgar, racist. In 2012, the Nobel laureate Toni Morrison wrote a play called Desdemona, in which a deceased Desdemona gets a chance to tell her side of the story of Othello. At different points in Shakespeare's Othello, all three female characters, Desdemona, Amelia and Bianca, are all referred to as, quote, whores. And there are lots of references in the play to women as property. Even after he's murdered Desdemona, Othello says, quote, "If heaven would make me such another world, of one entire and perfect chrysolite, I'd not have sold her for it." These two themes of racism and sexism or misogyny are brought together and highlighted in the opening of the play, where Brabantio, Desdemona's father, believes that his daughter's decision in denying her father's right to choose her husband in order to marry a black man can only be explained by witchcraft. That is to say, that a natural order in which men make decisions for women and people only marry within their own race, this natural order can only be subverted by supernatural forces which are both evil and unnatural. These questions about race and gender have been widened out into questions about how people's roles in society are defined and who gets to define them. Shakespeare includes Iago in this question. In Act 3, Scene 2, Iago has a speech which begins, quote, "And what's he then that says I play the villain?" Isn't, quote, honest Iago being patronised by his social superiors for being working class? As I've already mentioned, Othello ends up making racist remarks, and in Act 5, Scene 1, it's Emilia who calls Bianca a strumpet, quote unquote. Perhaps the real question here is who gets to decide who are the dogs and who are the whores, and the crux of the issue seems to be that these terms are used by people seeking to maintain and emphasise their power. Emilia attempting to mark a distinction between Bianca's behaviour and her own, and Othello reminding Ludovico that he has, quote, done the state some service as his power and authority evaporates. There are, of course, many other issues in Shakespeare's Othello that students might want to consider, one of which is the moral ambiguity of the play. For the first 150 years of Othello's existence, critics often complained that the play is unrealistic and that it is lacking in moral conclusions. In the late 17th century, Thomas Rymer, referencing the role of the handkerchief in the play, makes fun of Shakespeare's Othello by stating that the moral of the play is, quote, a warning to all good wives that they look well to their linen. In more recent times, critics have been more understanding of a play being unrealistic. This criticism now seems old-fashioned and faintly absurd. It's a play after all, it's not real. And we now admire plays which don't provide neat moral conclusions to complex human situations. Talking of the handkerchief, from the earliest times critics have complained about the handkerchief, that it's a trivial prop, that it has so-called magical properties, that it stretches credulity, that the handkerchief itself relies too much on chance for its appearance, for its loss, for its subsequent use or misuse. To counter these criticisms, some scholars have emphasised that the handkerchief is a symbol. Symbolically, the handkerchief signifies the bond between Othello and Desdemona, and therefore the loss of the handkerchief represents the breaking of that bond. Or perhaps the handkerchief signifies Othello's culture and origins. It was a gift from his mother, remember. And that in losing the handkerchief, Desdemona not only loses Othello, but also the space that Othello occupies as a black man in Venetian society. Then there's the question of Iago's motivation. Why does Iago do the things that he does? Happily, there is a whole other podcast that I have dedicated to Iago, so for now I'll confine myself to a short summary of what other critics have come up with over the centuries. The first critique of Iago stretches from the 18th century to the present day, namely that Iago has too many motives. Iago hates Othello because he missed out on a job becoming lieutenant. He suspects Othello has slept with his wife. He also suspects that Cassio has slept with his wife. Iago wants to sleep with Desdemona. He envies Cassio's virtues and manners. He's just flat plain racist. He's ripping off Rodrigo's money, so perhaps greed is a motive. Once you've added up all these possible motives that are mentioned in the play, either explicitly or implicitly, for Iago's actions, it's obvious that there are too many motives, which leaves it unclear why Iago does what he does. In short, the situation is not clearly articulated. The famous Shakespearean scholar A.C. Bradley, in Shakespearean Tragedy, the beginning of the 20th century, dismisses all these motives. He argues that revenge and jealousy are secondary factors for Iago, that Iago is quote-unquote motiveless. The flaw is in his character. Iago's evil is the outcome of his pride, in his own abilities and in his contempt for those around him. Not just his contempt from Rodrigo and Cassio, which is plain throughout the play, but also his contempt for Emilia, his wife, and Bianca, which is explicitly stated in the play. And then also finally a deep contempt for Othello and Desdemona, his social superiors, which is evidenced in his refusal to explain himself at the end of the play. A modern interpretation of Iago's motives is based around the idea that Iago is gay and is therefore motivated by a repressed homosexual desire for Othello. The disgrace of Cassio is only a pretext for his real desire, which is to get rid of Desdemona. That's why Iago spends so much time hanging around with Othello, and this explains Iago's misogyny. Of course he doesn't like women, he's gay. In this interpretation of the play, Othello is basically the portrait of a bromance that goes horribly wrong. If you think that interpretation of Othello is outlandish, how about this one? The psychoanalysts have taken a look at the play and concluded that Iago isn't a person at all. He's Othello's alter ego. In this view of the play, Iago's motivation reveals an ugly truth, that the devil lurking around us in human form is in fact part of ourselves, a reflection of our own destructive tendencies. After all, it's Othello who murders Desdemona, not Iago. Well, that's just a few ideas you might want to look at while studying Shakespeare's Othello. The original Othello was played by Shakespeare's friend and colleague, Richard Burbage. Conventionally, Othello wore a turban, a long flowing cape and red trousers, and he carried a large sword. The thumbnail for these series of podcasts on Othello is taken from the portrait of an ambassador from North Africa who visited the court of Queen Elizabeth I in 1600 and stayed for 6 months. The ambassador and his entourage caused something of a stir in London at that time, and I like to think there was something of a fashion for the exoticism of Africa, a bandwagon if you like, that Shakespeare jumped on in writing Othello. It's only idle conjecture, but it's my belief that Shakespeare did not consider jumping on a bandwagon to be beneath him. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Shakespeare's Othello, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Shakespeare Podcast.